All right. Hey, good morning again. If you've been with us over the last few weeks as we started this new year, you know that we've been in this sermon series in the book of Ruth. And one of the things we've been exploring is that, when people think of religious faith and communities, they think it's kind of a code of laws and to-dos and not to-dos. But what people are often surprised by is that actually, if you look in the sacred texts, many of them are narrative stories. Stories about people, real people who lived in this world and navigated through the ups and the downs of life and kind of lived on the other side to tell their story of God and the ways that he works in each of our lives. And we've been examining the story of Ruth and the story of Naomi and the story of Elimelech and the story of Boaz. And we've been kind of talking about this narrative where we see the story of God working in the lives of people, especially in light of a story where it looks like things look incredibly bleak and dark and dismal. And what we've been exploring is, what does God do, especially in moments when things feel like there is no hope? We are in the darkest moments. And so let me review back, because today we just read, as Samantha just read, was the last chapter in the book of Ruth. We're actually going to go back to the first chapter of Ruth, and I just want to remind us of how this story started. Because again, this was a narrative piece that was read to the ancient people of Israel so that they would know and learn about this real person named Ruth and kind of her historical significance. And it's so extraordinary to see where this story started and where it goes. So, for instance, this is what it says: in the days when the judges ruled. Now again, this is Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. This is how the story starts. There was a famine. It starts with famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem, which means house of bread in Judah, there is no bread in Bethlehem, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. So do you get this? There are these people who are refugees because of famine. They're living in this foreign land called Moab. Because they're starving. The man's name was Elimelech. We talked about the name Elimelech means the name God is king. But there's a lot of kind of irony in this, because his name is God and is king, but there's all sorts of ways in which it feels like God is not king, or at least he's not a benevolent king. His wife's name was Naomi, which means pleasant. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. They were these immigrants, refugees, who are now fleeing from famine and trying to make it. Now look at what happens in the story. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, he died. Now again, back then for women, the only kind of social capital or any chance at advancing in society was to be married. Now I know that sounds very archaic for today's day and world, but if you stay with me, she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other named Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. Both sons died. So if you can imagine, she loses her husband, she loses her sons, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she gets word that now Judah, Bethlehem, has become a house of bread again. She goes on her way. She and her daughters-in-law prepare to return home from there. Now look at what happens when she returns home. She says, the 2 women, because she ends up with Ruth, went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred up because of them. And the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi? Can this be this pleasant woman that we knew?" And look at what she says. "Don't call me Naomi," which means pleasant. "Don't call me pleasant. If you only knew what I've been through, the hell that I've walked through. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter." And that's what Mara means. Call me bitter. Don't call me pleasant. My life has changed completely. The Lord has brought, I went away full with a husband and 2 sons, and I've come back empty. Why call me pleasant? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. And look at how chapter 1 ends. If we go to the next slide. It ends by, it basically says that Ruth has come. Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite. All she's come back with. She left with a husband and 2 sons. And all she comes back with is this foreign woman named Ruth. And it accentuates it by saying it's her daughter-in-law. There's, what is she going to do? She's just this widowed, older woman with this young daughter-in-law who's a foreigner. And so arriving in Bethlehem as a barley harvest was beginning. So can you imagine this? So that chapter 1 then, it paints this scene of extreme harshness, difficulty. Naomi has gone from pleasant to becoming bitter. And it seems like she has nothing. All the resources that one would think would be important for someone in that ancient society. She has nothing. All she has is this foreign daughter-in-law. How in the world are they going to make it? Now, fast forward to the chapter that we just read. I mean, check out the story of what happens, right? Boaz is this man who enters in, and last week we explored, he's this kinsman redeemer who somehow Ruth is able to curry his favor. Boaz actually steps in. Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. Isn't this extraordinary? When it seemed like they were widows who had no sorts of social capital, there was someone named Boaz who looked with favor upon Ruth, marries her. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The woman said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord." Do you remember? This was the same Lord that Naomi was like, "Call me Mara. I am afflicted. The Lord has afflicted me." But look at what the people now say about Naomi. "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age for your daughter-in-law who loves you." Because the story is about Ruth and her uncommon faithfulness, which we talked about a couple weeks ago. "Who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Go to the next slide. Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. Again, this child that was born to Ruth. The women lived there said, "Naomi has a son. This is unbelievable." Because remember, at the beginning of the story, she came back empty, but here she is now with the promise of a son, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now, to an ancient listener, this idea of David, of course, the ancient listener knew that this is King David. And so just to accentuate that point, the author of the book of Ruth ends the story with a genealogy, with a lineage. So it started with this incredible bleak picture of like, what in the world's going to happen to Naomi and Ruth? They are foreign, they are poor, they have no sorts of social capital. They will simply be snuffed out of human history because that's what happens to the poor, the immigrant, the oppressed, the widowed. But the story ends with a genealogy, and the genealogy says, this then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Aminadab, Aminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz and Ruth, the father and mother of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse, of course, is the father of King David. Now, if you can imagine, now for us as Christians who live on this side of kind of this story, we all probably may have heard, even if you're not a Christian here, you may have heard this story that Jesus actually comes from the same genealogy, that Jesus Christ, the very central figure of the Christian faith, comes from this story. The story of an immigrant woman, a foreigner, no sorts of social capital, the poorest of the poor, who have been refugees, who feel like they've lost everything. They've gone from pleasant to becoming afflicted and bitter with no hope. And the story ends with a son who is part of a lineage, and a lineage that would lead to a king. I mean, isn't this extraordinary? The idea that somehow what God does is God takes the most wretched, awful, broken, painful moments of your life and mine. The moments in which we say, God has afflicted me, there is no hope for me, there is no way that God can do anything in my life. In fact, call me Mara. The fact that God can take Mara and make it beautiful again. Now, you know what's so extraordinary? Is that the Christian faith has always been about this kind of story, though. The kind of story about taking the worst parts of our lives, the lowest of the low, and making it beautiful. In fact, there were prophecies that would come to people that were oppressed, that were going through difficult moments. Prophecies constantly that would come, messages from God to his people to tell them in the midst of their oppression, their difficulty, their heartbreak, whatever they were going through, that God was going to move, that he was on their side. In fact, check out this passage from Isaiah chapter 61. This is a passage that foretells about the kind of God that we serve. People might have this image of a God who's vindictive and angry and judgmental and out to get you. And yet time and time again, the story of God and the story of who God is he takes us in the midst of the muddiest mire and he lifts us up. And so there are visions and there are prophecies about who this God is. So check this out. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor. I mean, don't you love this? Now, here's the thing. I know maybe you're not a Christian here and you're like, oh man, this Christian thing, it sounds really good. It lifts up the brokenhearted, but you know what? I kind of don't need that in my life. And in fact, Christianity, all Christians are people who just need the crutch of God. I don't need that because I'm a tough New Yorker, you know? And maybe that's you this morning. Well, here's what I want to confess to you. I just want to just throw this out there. What I want to confess to you is that's absolutely true. That Christians are people who have recognized that we can't do life without God. That somehow there comes these moments in our lives when we get brokenhearted, when we feel like captives, when we feel absolutely at the end of our rope, and we need to turn to a higher power and trust him. And I want to confess to you guys, if you're not a Christian here, again, this is what it means to be a Christian, to confess, I don't have what it takes. And there are moments in my life when I feel like Naomi, I feel when it's gone from pleasant, it's gone from great, to feeling like bitterness and like an awful situation in my life. And sometimes what I need is I need God. And in fact, what it means to be Christian is to believe this truth, to believe that it's actually in acknowledging my neediness. It's acknowledging my brokenness, acknowledging that I need God. And the most beautiful thing about this kind of story, well, because here's the reality, whether you're someone who's religious or you're not, you and I know that as tough as we are about being New Yorkers, about kind of being self-sufficient, smart, educated people, all of us have gone through those moments when we've all felt the pangs of brokenness and hurt and worry. Anyone who's lived in this city knows the feelings of like things that are beyond my control. Hello, R train, right? Like where things aren't going my way, where things feel like absolutely impossible given the financial condition of this city, given how difficult it is to raise a family in the city, given how difficult it is to remain faithful in this, given how cutthroat this city can be. I mean, every single one of us, as privileged as we might be to live in the city, all of us have experienced the pangs of hurt, of brokenness, of difficulty, of doubt. But here's what this story is all about, the story of Ruth. It's that God makes beauty from ashes. The living God can take our stories, our brokenness, our pain, our worst moments, the moments when we feel like we're at the bottom, and he can make something beautiful. Here's what this means. If you've come in here, maybe you've had a past. Well, guess what? Welcome to the club. Because the reality is every single one of us have parts of our brokenness, pain, and the story of Christianity is a story that tells us that God takes the ashes of the moments where perhaps you felt at the bottom of the hill, and he can make something beautiful. That God can take the story of Ruth and Naomi and make something so beautiful that from a story of peasant, immigrant, foreigners who have nothing, widows, God would bring a lineage of a king. You see, the story of God has always been a story of redemption that makes beauty out of ashes. I remember for me, times in my life that have been the most difficult. Even the story, as I was reflecting on even this church, like the birth of this church that's become a family of churches across the city. Like, it's funny when people want to hear this story of like, how was this church founded? How did it start? And usually, people are expecting me to say like, oh, I just had this vision and this burden. God was going to do something amazing. And I usually start with actually, it's a story that was birthed out of my own season of depression. A season of unemployment, and a season of wrestling with what my identity was. What's amazing is I look back on that season and I'm like, I would never want to go through that season ever again. But at the same time, I look back and I'm like, wow, God, it was in the mess and the mire and the pain. That's where the redemptive story came. And that's not to say that everything that's happened with Hope Church has been beautiful. It's simply to say that it really is out of our darkest moments that God can then begin to do something great. Now, every single one of us have had these moments. So whether it's in a relationship, whether you've gone through a divorce, whether you've gone through infertility, whether you've gone through an abortion, whether you've gone through moments where you feel like a breakup in relationships, whether you've gone through something where you feel utter shame, whether you've gone through a season of extreme addiction, whether you've gone through a season of, like, there's things that each one of us tell ourselves, I can never recover from this. God could never use this. And yet here's what this story tells us. What this story tells us is that God makes beauty from ashes. And he can take your story, and he can take my story, and make something beautiful. There's a form of Japanese pottery called Kintsugi. And Kintsugi is actually this form of pottery that actually takes shards of broken kind of pieces. And what this form of pottery is they take these broken pieces and with gold lacquer and things like that, they end up kind of sealing these pieces back together, and they create these beautiful bowls that have these scars on them, these scars in gold. And it's this form of pottery that really is meant to tell us that there is beauty in the brokenness. There's actually beauty in the pain and the cracks. And something extraordinary has to happen in each of our lives to be able to see that. Because if you're anything like me, my life was kind of fraught with this belief that somehow my life was all about perfection and achievement, and somehow like the fulfillment of my life is success and all the outer appearances of being put together. And yet the story of God is not necessarily that kind of story. In fact, it's rarely, if ever, that story. A story of you need to be perfect. You need to achieve this and that. In fact, it's always a story of people who have come before the living God and honestly simply confessed, I'm broken into a bunch of pieces. And God, I need you to put me back together. And you know what the beautiful thing about the Christian faith is? Is that the Christian faith is a lot like Kintsugi. It's putting together back our broken pieces, and the beauty is in the scars. I once heard this story of this one kind of evangelist named Harold Ironside, and he was challenged to this public debate. He was in the Bay Area. He was challenged to this public debate by this atheist. This atheist says, the merits of my atheism versus the merits of your faith. Let's duke this out. And Ironside came back to him and said, I will do this debate based on one condition. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring hundreds of people that have had their lives dramatically changed by belief in a God who makes beauty from ashes. Former addicts who have had their lives completely changed by faith in God. Well-to-do people who have been humbled and now have become loving husbands and wives, sons and daughters. I'll bring hundreds of them, and I want you to bring just one person who's had their life radically changed by atheism. And if you can do that, then yes, I agree to the terms of this debate. And of course, the person walked away. Now, I don't know whether that story is true or not. I thought it sounded kind of cool, though. And but I'd probably venture to guess that, yeah, there's been a lot of people who have lived to tell the story that God makes beautiful things out of ashes. And very few people can tell the story of how self-will or atheism has somehow dramatically changed a broken life. And here's what I want you to know, and I want me to know, and what I want all of us to know, is that God makes beauty out of ashes. And perhaps if you've been through a season in your life, or maybe you're hiding something that's happening in your life where you feel like, man, this can never be recovered by God, or God can never use this, or God can never redeem this, I just want you to know God makes beauty from ashes. Before our first son David was born, we found out, like, there are these tests that happen before birth, and we found out that there was a percentage chance that David would have Down syndrome. And for any parent who's been through that experience before, the harrowing experience, and I realize not many people share this. Like, when people have gone through this, I realize not many people share the story of how, like, all the anxieties that happen, and there are a lot of false positives, and so David ended up having one of those false positives. But I just want you to know, like, kind of in that season, I remember when we got the news, and then, weeks later, we got more news that it was even more probable that David would have Down syndrome. And, and so Tina and I are just kind of rocked a little bit, and we're wrestling with what does that mean for our family? Now, again, it was a false positive. My son is fine and healthy today. But I remember reading this book during that time because, there was a flurry of emotions that I was feeling. And I remember reading this book that was written by this woman named Amy Julia Becker. And the book is called A Good and Perfect Gift. And Amy Julia Becker, in this book, and I would highly recommend it, she is a Princeton grad, and the reason why I mention that is not because I want to say, like, Princeton, whatever, but she, in her own story, she's a Princeton grad, went to Princeton Seminary, so her whole life, she talks about, is about achievement and about success, and she values the mind and the intellect. And what she talks about a lot is her life was one that really valued perfection and being perfect. Turns out that the first daughter that was born to their family, they discovered upon her birth that she had Down syndrome. And so this book, A Good and Perfect Gift, is actually an autobiography that she tells the story of the first 2 years of raising her daughter, Penny. And I remember reading this story as we were kind of going through our own journey, and at different moments weeping and different moments. And she talks about the confusion of this moment because it's this moment, their first child is born, celebration. But then there's all this, hush whispers around from the nurses and the doctors, and the discovery that this child has Down syndrome. And then when the friends come, congratulations. But, and there's this, she has this theological tension with God and what God is doing and how could this have happened. And yet at the same time, there's the joy of this being our first child. And it's an extraordinary autobiography that she writes about this story. And the book is titled A Good and Perfect Gift because one of the things that she comes to realization over is how tremendously blessed she's been by her daughter, Penny. And she was interviewed about the book, and here's what Amy Julia says. She says, this book is about realizing that although we had not been given the daughter we expected, we had been given the daughter we wanted. There was a long progression for me, spiritually, emotionally, and intellectually, after Penny was diagnosed with Down syndrome. I had to confront some ugly truths about myself and what and who I valued and why. I really did have an implicit understanding that education and intellect were more valuable than anything else that makes someone human. I wouldn't have said that I believed that, but I discovered that was true about me. So I had to confront that and recognize that what I had believed was not in fact true, which in the end was freeing and life-giving. It allowed me not only to receive our daughter as a gift, but also to receive many other people who are different from me in a variety of ways and to recognize the value they have as human beings created in God's image. Julia Becker has started a blog and a ministry where she begins to tell the story of being a parent of someone with special needs. And of course, she talks about how her daughter is a good and perfect gift. And isn't it amazing how God takes what feels like ashes and makes something beautiful? You know what's the wonder of the Christian journey? Is that when people think of, oh yeah, God is this crutch and God, yeah, this is, and oftentimes God can often be used as this way for perhaps Christians, and maybe you've experienced this or maybe you've used God this way, as God as being this kind of like genie in a bottle, lightning bolt that you're really standing on behalf of God to judge everyone else in the city and everyone else that's sitting next to you in this church. But, the Christian faith has always been about a different story, a different portrayal of who God is. Because the kind of God who God is not a God who comes with overpowering kind of muscles and, sorry, I don't know what I had in my mind right there, but like just this overwhelming presence, But instead, God comes as a healer, but actually as a wounded healer. In fact, one of the prophecies about the way that God would heal his people was a prophecy that basically, that it's by his wounds we are healed. That God heals us through his very wounds. It's the wounds of Jesus. It's when we entrust our lives to a wounded Savior. It's when we realize that it's actually in our brokenness and in our messed upness and in our deepest pains. It's actually through that Jesus actually also heals us. And he makes something beautiful. And the invitation to you and the invitation to me is, what can God make beautiful for you today? What kind of hope can he give you today? Because he really does make beauty from ashes.